Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of ASEAN Pacific Affairs. In this episode today, we are going to talk about the defense transformation in Japan in the context of the geopolitical developments. Today, my guest is Dr. Corey Wallace. Corey Wallace will be with me. Let me introduce my guest to you, the audiences. Corey Wallace is an assistant professor at Kanagawa University, the Faculty of Foreign Language. He was previously Einstein Foundation Visiting Fellowship Postdoctoral Research at the Graduate School of East Asian Studies, Freie University of Berlin, between 2015 and 2019. Corey is originally from New Zealand and has worked in the New Zealand Public Service advising on science and technology policy before receiving his PhD in international relations and politics from the University of Auckland. Corey has published on regional geopolitics in a number of academic journals, including co-editing a special edition of Chatham House International Affairs on Japan's pivot to Asia in 2018. His research interests include Japanese national security and domestic politics, science, technology, and innovation policy, and industrial development and aid policy in East Asia. Welcome, Corey. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Let me start I'm gonna start with the most important topic around the Japan, regarding the Japan and Taiwan. Is Japan's interest to Taiwan's security is new? It is a new development because why has this suddenly become a major issue for Tokyo and for the LDP until now? Maybe we didn't hear it in how we can say loudly.
Yeah, no. I think from the point of view of the political discourse in Japan, it's very clear that Taiwan is getting a lot more attention because you only need to go back about 4 or 5 years. There was some legislation before the Japanese Parliament which would allow the Japanese Self-Defense Force to cooperate more with the United States in the region. But during this debate over this legislation, there was almost no mention of Taiwan. There was mention of all these other wonderful and unusual scenarios, but nobody would use the T word, Taiwan, right? But it seemed to me at the time that the legislation was perfectly geared for potentially allowing Japan to make some kind of contribution if there was a conflict over Taiwan, and it included the United States as well, of course. So fast forward 4 to 5 years, we're definitely seeing a lot more freer discussion inside of Japan about the Taiwan issue, about Taiwan's security, and about, the linkages between Japan and Taiwan and so forth. So nevertheless, I think it's important to say, though, that the geostrategic importance of Taiwan has not necessarily changed, because for Japan's defense thinkers and strategists, they've always seen Taiwan as a really important geostrategically, because there's a few reasons. One, if there is a conflict, Japan's Okinawa is right there, the southwestern islands in particular, the Senkaku Islands. If there was a conflict, even if Japan didn't want to be involved, I don't see how it doesn't spill over one way or another into Japan's own backyard. And secondly, if Taiwan was, say, taken over, you would have the PLA on Taiwan, and that has some implications for, say, for example, sea lanes, maritime security, and who knows in the future in terms of maybe more expansive policies. The ability to project power from Taiwan into Japan's Okinawan area would also be enhanced for China, at least anyway. So anyway, these things have always been in the back of the mind of defense thinkers, but the fact that they're actually able to give voice to these is definitely a newer development there.
So the Corey, I would like to little bit go to the deep. Why the recently this issue come to on the table? Now every people, at least all the media outlets who are interested to the region, they are talking
Right.
about the Taiwan and Japan. Is it because of the rising China, and the increase the power projection of PLA, and to the region, or this is
Yeah.
about the Japan's domestic affairs? What is the real reason behind this debate?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a few things, I think. So, yeah, of course, as China's own power projection is enhanced, then the Taiwan question becomes a much more important one. And in some ways, it's, there are a whole range of different, territorial issues in Northeast Asia. But Taiwan's the only one that really involves a really large amount of people with their own society and, you know, major economic implications as well. So, there's certainly something worth losing there, you could say. Um, Now, from the point of view of why Japan has been able to speak more loudly recently, I think there's two things that are really important. The first one is the international dimension, especially during COVID-19 pandemic. Um, if Japan had have spoken out about Taiwan maybe 5 or 6 years ago, probably Japan would have been criticized by even others in the international community as being provocative. It's like, why are you, annoying China by, touching on this core security interest of theirs? Japan's at it again and doing all these unhelpful things. But recently, there's been a lot more support throughout the international community for not so much, Taiwan independence or anything like that, but at least for, recognizing Taiwan as a valid society with its own desires and ambitions and dreams and so forth. So I think to a certain degree, Japan has more international cover now than before because other countries are interested in it. And it's not just a matter of, Japan being the only one provoking China, which is probably what they want to avoid. So that's the first thing. And I think that the second thing that's helped maybe embolden some people in Japan to talk about Taiwan more is changes in domestic opinion. So traditionally, you could say that people who really were interested in the Taiwan issue in Japan tended to be much more sort of conservative, very anti-China, and almost in some ways they would support Taiwan as a way to sort of get back at China or get at China. But that's changed a lot in the last decade or so, even longer perhaps. And yes, the people who right now are leading the charge about closer Japan-Taiwan relations are probably a little bit more hawkish, but I think they have some support uh, domestically more than before. I think the younger generation probably see Taiwan as a good example of a successful democracy. It doesn't hurt that Taiwanese people, perhaps in Northeast Asia, are the only ones that have very good feelings towards Japan. And there's a whole, range of different interconnections between Taiwan and Japan that have developed recently. So it's not just a, conservative thing anymore. It's a much broader um, interest of many people in Japan these days. So I think that's another reason why um, we're seeing a lot more discussion. And COVID-19, I guess, just brought that out into the open. So
Uh,
yeah.
about I go to the jump to the Quad, about the Quad Trilateral Security Dialogue, one of the also Japan are member.
Mm.
What is the Japanese commitment to the Quad, especially after the Shinzo Abe?
Yeah, so I guess you could say that after Abe left office, there were some concerns about, I mean, in some ways, the Quad and the Indo-Pacific concepts were, you know, Abe played a really important role in promoting those in Japan as well as even throughout the diplomatic community. So some people thought like, is Japan going to go back to the old way of, not being very proactive? And certainly, you have to give Abe some credit in terms of the political diplomatic energy he invested in these, both the Indo-Pacific vision and the Quad diplomacy. But I think it's important to also recognize that he didn't really have to go against anybody in his own country. The Indo-Pacific idea and the Quad ideas, the idea of broadening beyond the US-Japan alliance is quite popular throughout the political spectrum in Japan. Some people might emphasize the economic aspects, some might emphasize the cultural aspects, the diplomatic aspects, some might emphasize defense. But in whatever the emphasis is, you will see a lot of support for these ideas. And, the bureaucratic agencies themselves all kind of identify their own sort of interests in promoting better relations with Indo-Pacific countries or with India, Australia, in addition to the United States. So I think in some ways, Abe showed leadership to sort of shape these sorts of initiatives, but I think they will have staying power because they are also, there's a lot of buy-in with that throughout the political spectrum and, throughout the bureaucratic spectrum as well. So I do think, though, that maybe you could say with the Quad that it's undergone a little bit of a rebranding in the last year or so. And I think that will be very, very helpful for sustaining Japanese diplomatic interest in this, because, it's more about the provision of public goods, international public goods. And, it's not just about sort of defense exercises and so forth. It's a much broader sort of thing. So, that appeals to people back home. It appeals to different bureaucratic agencies, and, they can all invest some of their pet projects put it into the Quad framework, now that it's about a whole lot of different things: quality infrastructure, vaccine diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think I don't expect to see either the Indo-Pacific concepts or the Quad concepts or support go away in Japan anytime soon.
No, there is another important topics we should mention: Aux Agreement. I would like to asking about Aux Agreement because it's there is a nuclear submarine technology. This is about the security of the countries. What is the Japan's attitude toward the AUKUS? Some predictions of the scholars said maybe in the future Japan can include to the AUKUS agreement. What will be your take on this issue?
Yeah, so with AUKUS, I think there's two things. There's the way AUKUS happened, the diplomatic creation of it, and then I think there's the concept and the potential for the idea. And I think on the first one, Japan was a little bit, well, not angry or anything, but just a little bit surprised and maybe felt left out a little bit. And, it does have that sort of sense of being a very Anglo project, just the three of the Five Eyes got together and did everything that they did against France. And, there's sort of, I guess you could say the atmospherics around it probably weren't so great. And in Japan, it was definitely noticed that it was a little bit of a Anglosphere project. And whether Japan itself would be included, whether it would be welcome in the future. So there was that aspect that didn't go down so well. I think also there's probably a feeling in Tokyo that the relationship with France was unnecessarily harmed, and it could have been handled better. Because for the most part, Japan, I guess you could say that Japan wants as many outside players in the region as part of the Indo-Pacific Party, I guess you could say. And France is one of them. They have, even territory in the so-called Indo-Pacific area. So I think that aspect, I think people in Tokyo probably thought that was a little bit unnecessary. But beyond that, of course, the Japanese are reasonably, I think, supportive of it. The idea that Australia has greater power projection both through the nuclear submarines and their ability to remain at sea further away than before, as well as the potential for Australia to get hold of cruise missiles and various other types of important technology. So from Japan's point of view, the relationship with Australia is probably the second best relationship, security relationship Japan has after the United States, of course. So there will definitely be, support for that aspect of it. For the time being, Japan is not part of it, and maybe that might not be such a bad thing, because I guess I've heard one Japanese analyst friend of mine said that AUKUS could almost be like the bad cop to the Quad's good cop. The Quad's been rebranded as a more diverse, broader sort of project, while AUKUS is the focus of defense, the more sort of hard-edged defense aspects. So that's one part of it there. But even if, as you mentioned, in the long term, there are potential opportunities for Japan to join in the sort of technology sharing of AUKUS. Japan has its own sort of submarine program, and it's very much geared towards sort of an evolutionary, non-nuclear sort of, what do you say, sort of a non-nuclear program at this point in time. But there are discussions about maybe not, you wouldn't replace the whole Japanese submarine fleet with nuclear-powered vessels, but there could be some options for Japan to acquire a few vessels of that nature in the future. And of course, the discussion about cruise missiles, especially submarine-launched cruise missiles, would be something that, while potentially controversial in Japan, would probably interest some defense thinkers here as well.
Now, the query: Japan's economic and security diplomacy in Indo-Pacific is huge. Japan had almost engaged every country in Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific region. Is it about the countering to China, or this is an independent policy of Japan?
Yeah, so I think that's it's one of these key things where it's like, I guess it's both, right? Like, of course, it would be silly to say that it's not about China. There is definitely a motivating factor there regarding China, and some of it's just sort of like a chess game. China does one thing, Japan does another to check that. But I think it's also about Japan providing help to those countries to perhaps do things more for themselves. And, those countries have a lot of resources, both natural resources as well as labor resources, and, they're strategically placed and all that sort of stuff. In some ways, Japan knows that it cannot be a regional hegemon. That time is gone. But they can certainly help other countries perhaps make use of their own resources for themselves, and maybe not let China have everything its own way, so to speak. So I guess the question there is that, China has clearly a lot of hard power resources, economically, militarily, and so forth. But can they turn those resources into influence? Of course, they can do to some degree, but Japan provides, I guess you could say, various types of security, economic, structure assistance, technological assistance to these countries. Maybe that can reduce their dependencies on China to a certain degree that might allow them to make greater decisions themselves. So I guess, there's that aspect of it. And, it's not even, part of it is about China's growing maritime strength, both the military as well as the, as you could say, the constant subject authority, the Coast Guard and so forth. But it's also a great interest in Japan for a lot of the societies to be stable themselves, and especially when it comes to non-traditional security issues, it's a net benefit for Japan to see those countries also stable economically and in terms of non-traditional security aspects as well. And then, of course, there's the long-term demographic trends and so forth. There's opportunities for Japan there. Beyond China, if you look at, say, the Mekong area or the Bay of Bengal area, East Africa even, like there's going to be such massive population growth and urbanization over the next 20 or 30 years. Of course, there are the environmental implications of that, but even just, the fate of a country can rest on how well it develops its cities. It's a very simple sort of thing in a way, but very difficult to implement. If you get very well-organized cities that are vibrant, economically prosperous, then those areas could well develop very well. If they have very chaotic cities that don't work so well, then this demographic opportunity becomes a demographic kind of almost a disaster, maybe in some ways. The societies, developed emerging countries in the Indo-Pacific area don't develop as well. So, there's that sort of combination of self-interest plus a sort of more broader view toward seeing development in the area. So, yeah, it's hard to disentangle that from the China balancing aspect, but I think it's important to recognize that.
I think when we're talking about the countering China and talking about the Japan's, I think another topics we should mention that the COVID-19 diplomacy. During the COVID-19 diplomacy, do you think the Japan using as a tool to countering China in the region?
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's a perfect example of what we were just talking about. Is that, of course, it's clear that there's some significant PR opportunities for Japan, considering China's role in the initial sort of spread of COVID-19 or the virus. So I think, that is very clearly a PR diplomatic angle there. I think that's really important. But again, I think, it comes in the context of things that Japan has done before in the region. So I think probably most people don't realize, but some of the development projects like Japan, Southeast Asia, with Vietnam, Indonesia, and various countries have, for example, focused on things like advising on social security systems, helping or trying to encourage pension schemes to be set up. And one of them is universal health care. So I'm not saying that Japan is funding universal health care in Southeast Asia, far from it, but based on Japan's own experience in the 1950s, where they started to set up these systems, even before Japan had gotten rich again, I think was a very valuable thing for Japan that I think they perceive as being potentially very useful for a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, which you could say are emerging. They're sort of middle income. They can probably start to afford social security, but it's hard to implement. It's not something to do. So I think the vaccine diplomacy comes within the context of the broader health diplomacy that Japan has been promoting for a while there, and that it has good PR benefits for Japan. Certainly, I found.
Now, Corey, I will ask about another debate, the Japan's missile capability. What is the Japan's long-range strike debate and potential implication for East Asia and geopolitics of East Asia, also on the US-Japan alliance in the region?
Yeah. Okay. So it's a hard one to sort of disentangle as well. But recently, there's been a lot more debate in Japan about whether Japan should have the ability to strike into the territory of other countries in Northeast Asia. So in particular, most of the discussions focused on North Korea. If North Korea, in some kind of mad fit, decided to launch missiles towards Japan, could Japan prevent that right now? Especially if they weren't convinced that the United States would come to Japan's aid. So there is some sort of debate about, well, Japan got cruise missiles, then perhaps they could, even if they can't prevent the initial attack, they could eliminate follow-up attacks by striking missile bases on North Korea. The only problem is that that was sort of a conversation of maybe sort of like 15 to 20 years ago that could have been possible, but with the types of advances in missile technology and the mobility of the launch systems that North Korea even has now, the idea of striking North Korean missile positions as a form of ballistic missile defense is no longer really very viable. So there's been a lot of debate in Japan about that, but there is some sort of angst domestically that it's not really about preventing ballistic missile launches, but maybe perhaps acquiring a much broader power projection capability that could even be used further afield, perhaps even against China. So it's a kind of a complicated topic to sort of go into, because the thing is with almost every piece of military equipment, like, there's especially in Japan, Japanese politics, there's always a desire to sort of categorize it. Is this a offensive system or is this a defensive system? And the reality is, especially for modern military systems, is that you can't really make that distinction. And even long-range missiles have a number of different uses that they can strike into the territory of another country, perhaps sort of what we call a surgical strike on, say, like a political leadership, as we saw in Iraq even. But they can be also used to attack military positions, perhaps like ports, runways. That can be useful if you were trying to prevent, say, a China attack Taiwan or the Senkaku Islands. They could well overwhelm Japan very quickly with its navy. Well, perhaps you want to sort of stop them from being able to sustain that force projection. So, there's things like that. And there's even defensive applications as well. Like, for example, the missile that Japan is currently researching to turn into a long-range missile, perhaps up to 1,000-kilometer range, is its Type 12 missile, which basically traditionally has only had a range of about a couple of hundred kilometers, used off some of the outlying islands. The idea being that it would be able to attack ships if they came too close to Japanese territory. So that's been sort of repurposed to be a much larger, have a much wider range, larger range. But the reality is that it's not so much about striking deeper into the territory of other countries, but it can also be utilized, up and down the Japanese archipelago. If there was a sort of maritime conflict in and around Japan, then deploying lots of different launch systems further at different locations could potentially be very useful for Japan. Currently, a lot of Japanese and even American, actually, military hardware and platforms are on very vulnerable islands, very small islands in Japan's southwest. They could well be very hard to defend if there was a sudden massive attack on those islands. So, longer range missiles basically give more options for defense as well as for offense. So it's really, really hard to disentangle these aspects of it. And anyway, over the next couple of years, I expect these sorts of debates to continue in Japan. But what Japan can and should do with its recently longer range missiles acquiring.
Now, lastly, the Korean headwinds and tailwinds in public opinion that could hurt help further transformation of Japan's security policy as a geopolitical environment continues to evolve. What is your observation? What are you thinking about such issues, important issues?
Yeah, so I mean, everybody knows that Japan has had a slightly different approach to security since its, I should say, its unfortunate World War II experiment, and for many years, Japan was considered to be a so-called pacifist country, and any sort of discussion about spending a lot of money on defense, or discussion about missiles, longer range missiles that could attack other countries, was basically ignored or downplayed considerably for a long time. But recently we've started to see a lot more debate about this. So, to a certain degree, that's a direct reflection of the geopolitical changes and the concerns about not just the DPRK, but also China's own military transformation. There's an increasing sense that if Japan gets caught up in some kind of war in the area, it's less likely to be due to, say, something the United States did, and much more likely to do with something that China did. At least that balance is changing over time. In the past, a lot of people in Japan tended to see being too close to the United States as potentially being a little bit dangerous. But now I think it's not that balance is sort of shifting the opposite way. So that aspect there is changing, and that's probably loosening up the range of debates in Japan, as is the geopolitical situation. So that's, I guess you could say, the tailwind. But there's still quite a lot of headwinds there, and I think probably the most important one is not even a security-related, or at least not a national security or national politics-related issue, but it's social security, I guess, domestic security for the population. And there's a lot of discussion about how Japan needs to spend a lot more on its defense if it wants to be a good ally for the United States, or does not want to be the global policeman anymore. And so if that happens, there was obviously some expectations on Japan to pick up the burden in some various ways to do that. But the issue there, though, is that while I don't think the Japanese public is perhaps as anti-defense or anti-militarist as people imagine it to be, I think there's a sort of a tension between the idea of spending more on defense and spending less on, say, social security, when in reality, a lot of Japanese people, I mean, Japan's still a rich country, and it's still got a lot of, potential, technological potential and all that sort of stuff, but a lot of people are not necessarily optimistic about the future. They feel a degree of social insecurity. Families are worried about things like education, which is quite expensive in Japan, and various things like that. So I think the government has to be very careful that if it does increase defense spending, it has to sort of put it in the framework of sort of trying to address domestic insecurity. And that could be very difficult because there are, of course, limited resources, fiscal resources to do that. But nevertheless, I do think you don't get a more proactive Japan that addresses its national insecurity without also addressing some of these issues. So I think that's the main tailwind there. The main headwind for further defense transformation. That the public is open to further change, but they're still kind of skeptical of sort of very radical change in policy, especially if they don't feel that they're going to also be taken care of at the same time.
Now, Corey, since you told me you don't have enough time, there is a few questions. I just pick up two questions and ask to you. Then let me choose. Okay, Lucy Kanye, how will Japan's acquisition of Longrange missiles be received by its neighbors? In particular, what will be the attitude of South Korea, another ally of the US?
Yeah, so I think this is another one of those sort of tricky issues where I think, so I mean, the acquisition of the long-range missiles themselves is perhaps not as important as the mission that they're conceptualized as being for, right? So if Japan acquires the missiles for, I mean, they can be used for maritime security, as I explained before. You can sort of adjust your positions within the Japanese archipelago. Project power into Japan's maritime south, various ways. So the missiles themselves, I think, probably not such of an issue. But if Japan sort of, my microphone dropped off. But I think if Japan frames it as a striking to Korean territory independently, then that sort of has some potentially problematic implications for the US-Japan alliance as well as US-ROK alliance. So I think the reality is that for the mission of attacking North Korean missile positions, not only is it unrealistic, it's also really a huge inefficient waste of Japanese resources trying to do that from the Japanese mainland when the United States and the Republic of Korea are much better positioned to take care of what's happening in North Korea at any given time. So I think there's a sort of, if it was framed in that sort of way, I think the South Korea could probably rightly ask, why are you so determined to do that when it's not even a very good use of your resources? If you want to support the US-Japan alliance, you could do it in a variety of other different ways that would be much more useful. So I think the South Korea issue will have to be managed carefully. But the reality is that as much as there are tensions between South Korea and Japan, and I think both sides there's some responsibility for at least the nature of some of the diplomatic engagements and criticism. A improved relationship with South Korea is really, really important for Japan, just from a very narrow security point of view. And it'd be interesting to see how that sort of evolves over the next few years. And a lot of it will even simply depend on who wins the South Korean presidential election coming up.
I think the neighbor's attitude is very important, a significant aspect of the long-range missile. When the subject is long-range missile, your own decision is not enough. Also, what you have to think what your neighboring, also China will think, what Taiwan are think, what the ASEAN country. This is another obstacles and issues, complex issue. Yeah,
sure, absolutely. So, I mean, if there's a slightly more pro-Japan, well, maybe not pro-Japan, but more sympathetic to Japan person in the Blue House in Seoul, and under the current Japanese Prime Minister, he's in the past tended to want to promote better relations with South Korea, then there may be chances to maybe turn down the volume of some of the conflict. They're not going to go away. Both sides are very resolute in their territorial and various other disputes that they have. But how they're managed can be done in a different way, I think. So it could be some interesting opportunities for turning things around in the next few years, but we'll see. I generally tend towards pessimistic on South Korea and Japan relations from everything that I've seen over the years. So.
This is also the changing security environment in the region put Japan in a difficult position, because also I think in the region there is a slowly growing arm race, especially in Southeast Asia from Pacific. There is another agreement. The Japan also should think. Okay, let me choose another question. Inshallah. Is Japan's current economic situation an obstacle to acquiring costly long-range missiles and defense systems? Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a
These
good
are,
question.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yes and no. I mean, to be honest, the long-range missiles, especially if you're talking about cruise missiles and even ballistic missiles, which Japan swears that it cannot have under its constitution, but they're actually in a way considerably cheaper than the missiles or the interceptors they use in ballistic missile defense systems, which also don't always hit their target, or we're not sure how effective they would actually be in a real fight as opposed to stage situations. So, I mean, they cost a lot of money, but then the missiles themselves don't necessarily cost that much. What would be the big barrier for Japan for not so much acquiring long-range missiles, but for acquiring long-range missiles for attacking ballistic missile sites in North Korea, for example, is Japan would need to acquire support systems, a various range of different support systems. We call them ISR systems for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. They would, various other types of systems that would have to be able to operate close to North Korea to detect identify where the threats are, target them, strike them, come back again, surveil, recon, everything. I mean, this all will take a significant amount of resources that are probably going to be very expensive to maintain, even as well as to acquire, much more than the missiles themselves. So I think that's probably the important thing. And if you think about it, how much it will cost to acquire all of those support systems in addition to the longer range missiles, and even then you're probably not going to be very successful in the mission identified, then there's some questions about whether it's a good use of money. But in terms of acquiring some longer range missiles, say for example for maritime security purposes, which as I said before, the Type 12 anti-ship missile is being reconfigured. I don't think that will be especially expensive at this particular point in time.
There is another point I would like to mention. Also, we are talking now. There is a hypersonic missile and supersonic
Right.
missile.
Yeah.
This, the issue of time and speed.
Yeah.
And they put it another burden on the defense system.
Right.
How
Yeah.
to handle this, and I think need to another cost, another budget.
Yeah. So Japan has started to invest in developing the so-called some hypersonics, as well as the sort of skip glide sort of missile systems, which are all imagined to be able to confound any ballistic missile defense systems. So Japan itself is also investing in those systems, and there's certainly a lot less enthusiasm in Japan for ballistic missile defense the last few years, I've noticed. I mean, obviously, Aegis Ashore was cancelled. Nevertheless, though, I mean, if you think about these systems as like absolute defense systems where nothing gets through, then yes, you're going to be bitterly disappointed. But there is some value for them in the sense that if they can at least take out some, I mean, if we're talking about nuclear missiles, this is a completely different sort of issue, but sort of conventional ballistic missiles or cruise missile systems, if you can sort of mitigate damage on your own bases and on your own naval platforms and all that sort of stuff, and you can keep going, then that in itself is a form of deterrence. because if your opponent is trying to overwhelm you with a saturation attack, and it basically disables your ability to respond at an almost preemptively, then yeah, they've already won essentially. But if you can sort of regroup and limit damage to a certain degree, and then perhaps go on the counteroffensive, then that may make them think twice before initiating the original attack. So then, yeah, I think all of these sorts of things play into the calculus. But if you want a magic bullet weapon, then yeah, there is none when it comes to many of the different issues that Japan has in its defense and whatnot. There's no magic piece of hardware that will solve these issues.
Corey, I'm not sure. There is last two questions if you have time. If you don't
Yeah,
have
it's fine. Yeah.
Okay. What kind of reforms were made to get rid of Japan's passive defense attitude during the Abe administration?
Yeah. So it depends on what mean by passive here exactly, but
I think mention it to the pacifist article. Or
the pacifist. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Well, I don't know. In some ways, I think Abe had an opportunity to push forward on a lot of these things due to the geopolitical environment. And he pushed I think as far as he could, but I'm not necessarily sure I would say that Japan has become that much more hawkish over the Abe administration. In fact, Abe himself struggled quite a lot to get through the legislation he did in 2015. And even his desire for constitutional revision was somewhat, well, I mean, it didn't turn out. He didn't even really broach the topic other than to get the LDP to commit to some basic provisions and so forth. But I think the key though is that they need to balance a couple of different things as they go forward. Like so, the public will allow a certain degree of defense spending or increase in defense spending or some degree of transformation as long as some of the other aspects, economic elements, economic well-being is taken care of. So it's something I sort of emphasized before, but I don't think there's necessarily any sort of kind of blank check there for any of Japan's leaders to go forward on defense transformation. They will have to manage it very, very carefully. And to be honest, the thing that I haven't mentioned that should be mentioned is, well, Komeito, the LDP's coalition partner, is probably the most, even more than some of the center-left parties, a little bit skeptical of investing a lot of money into national defense. So they absolutely won't accept a defense increase that doesn't also come along with an increase in welfare spending as well. So that's something that also have to be managed quite carefully, I think. So yeah, it's I wouldn't necessarily say the broader political context is gung-ho in Japan right now. There's any political leader that wants to make defense changes will have to be very skilled and have to do a lot of groundwork and behind the scenes sort of reassurance as well.
Okay, this last question. How will Japan's acquisition of long-range missiles be received by... Oh, no, sorry. I already... Yes, fresh. Will Japan be part of Aux Agreement in the near future? You already mentioned partly, I think, this one. If you have more things is okay. What is the probability that the US will share the nuclear technology with Japan? Yes.
That would be a question for an American expert, I think. But Japan has definitely expressed interest in the AUKUS agreement. As I said, there are some things.
For joining or for
Well,
expressing for
I
joining
think
or
I'm not sure about joining necessarily, but I want to know more information about what this sort of sharing is geared towards. And I think it's not just about nuclear propulsion technology, but it's also about, like for example, combat systems, which would include the Tomahawk cruise missile, but also cyber security related elements as well. And so,
Corey, I think that am I right under the Aux Agreement that the US shared the nuclear technology via nuclear submarine to the Australia.
they said they are considering it, although I'm not sure if the United States will do it. Perhaps the United States will allow the United Kingdom to share that technology. But there is actually some skepticism whether it will actually happen. So we would have to see that first. But if Australia and the United Kingdom, for example, are successful in putting on the table a actual plausible nuclear propelled submarine, then Japan will certainly sort of express its own interest, I think, at that time. There are some potentially important uses for Japan. Japan sees some potentially important uses for a nuclear submarine balloon, but its nuclear fleet, its submarine fleet will, I think, remain mostly in along the same lines as it currently is, which is a conventionally based one, mainly for anti-submarine warfare rather than for projecting power and attacking other countries or anything like that. So, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think it's important to say that we need to see how it plays out between Australia and the US and UK first. This is not a guaranteed development. Some Australian analysts actually think it's actually unlikely that Australia will have a nuclear propelled submarine in the next 10 to 15 years. So,
what is the problem? The problem is budget or cost or the nuclear free zone over the Pacific. What is the exact problem? Why some Australian opposite to the agreement?
I think the main issue is just that Australia's not really managed its big spending defense programs very well up until now. And in 2009 they identified the need for a 12 submarine fleet to replace the Collins class submarines. And 11 years later, we're seemingly, after cancelling the French contract, no closer to getting a submarine in the water, much later actually. So, there's this sort of issue of not only the sensitivity over the technology, but whether Australia can actually, I guess you could say, come up with a sort of the infrastructure and to support the technology and basically implement the design process and everything, bring it all together. In any sort of reasonable time frame. So, these sort of programs are immensely complicated, and even at the best of times, they can have big cost overruns. And you add something like a nuclear propulsion system into that, the potential for delays becomes much more significant.
I would like to add some little bit thing, then I am going to conclude. The one that we talk much about the Aux Agreement, but I would like to about the geopolitical aspects of the nuclear submarine, and if Australia acquire this submarine, it will be give ability to Australia to deploy the submarine from the South China Sea, East China Sea, and through the Northeast Asia. what kind of implication will be on Japan's national security or China, and Japan will be more eager to looking for the nuclear submarine.
Yeah, for sure, Japan would would not be upset if a Australian nuclear-propelled submarine was patrolling the area, providing support to the United States with a advanced combat system, perhaps loaded up with Tomahawk cruise missiles like the Ohio-class submarines that the United States has. So probably wouldn't be quite that ambitious, but nevertheless, from the point of view of the functioning of the US-Japan alliance, those American submarines already play an important deterrence role. So Australia joins that party, so to speak. From Japan's point of view, I think that would be very welcome. So I imagine that there will be very few concerns raised in Tokyo about it. The question is will that complicate Australia's relations with its Southeast Asian neighbors? And that will require, I think Australia can manage that, but it will require perhaps a sort of change in tone in terms of its own diplomacy. And, for Japan, it really wants to see not only good relations between Australia and the US and Australia and Japan, but it sees a lot of advantages for close relations between Australia and Indonesia, Australia, Philippines, Australia, and Vietnam. So, and, of course, with Singapore and Malaysia in the context of the five power defense arrangements as well. So if this kind of program led to diplomatic tensions between Australia and its neighbors, I don't think that would be seen as positive.
Yes, ASEAN countries, member countries also is another example. Now,
Sure.
the many people talking about the arm race, the India's hypersonic missiles to the Filipino, and now there is another door to discussion if another member of ASEAN countries will acquire, looking forward to acquire the BrahMos. And Indonesia case, made an agreement, I think inside a few days. They made one agreement with France about the Rafale aircraft, and with the United States after this is another strategic aspects, I think, triggered by Aux Agreement.
Quite possibly, yeah. So, if AUKUS only creates diplomatic tensions and doesn't end up delivering any kind of, progress in sort of defense cooperation or technological sharing, then, it might go down as a little bit of a bit of a failure there, I think. But, we'll see. I don't know. We'll see how all these things develop over the next few years.
Yes, there is. Lastly, I would like to point out that the many analysts believe that the only beneficiary of this arm race and agreements will be China, but we don't know. Time will show us who is wrong.
Yeah. There's a lot of hard work to do to make AUKUS a sort of a useful contribution to the security framework in the area.
Yes, thank you very much, Corey. We're talking, I think, we handled today a lot of the topics, talking about the Japan-Taiwan relation. We start from the Taiwan-Japan relation, security, environment, geopolitics, and we come to Quad and the AUKUS and the submarine. Now, Southeast Asia also included, was one part of our discussion. Thank you very much for this great conversation. You take your time.
Great questions from the audience too. Yep. It's very late here, but thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Also, I would like to make last thanks to my question for this amazing question. And please don't forget to share this video with your networks and like our video and subscribe to channel, please. Thank you very much for upcoming shows. Please stay tuned and subscribe to channel. Have a nice day. Have a nice night. Where you are from, which part of the world. Thank you very much. Okay, bye.